looking. Settings, there it goes. Oh, little freeze there. Alright. Let's just jump right in. Go into the next section here. Greater than 60 big blinds facing limpers. I guess I should put the sound on so you guys can hear.
Now let's discuss when there are limpers before the action gets to you. And just to be very clear, a limper is someone who just calls the big blind. So if you're playing 100, 200 blinds, if someone puts in 200, they're not raising, they are calling. A caller is also referred to as a limper. And we're going to first discuss when we're playing against only one limper. Then we'll later discuss how to play against multiple limpers. In general, you're going to find there are two types of limpers. There are tricky limpers and straightforward limpers. And we will be discussing how to play against each of those because they use very different strategies.
The tricky ones, that used to be a thing to a much greater degree, but now 95% of the time when you see a limp, it's just straightforward. It's just somebody who wants to see a flop with a pair or some kind of suited connector or hand that's not good enough to raise with in their mind, but they're in the bad position, so they want to play it. That's why you always want to raise when somebody limps if you're going to come in.
And you should know if your
Pretty much always. There are instances where you'll limp along.
opponents use different strategies, you in turn should use different strategies. So, tricky limpers typically limp with only the best hands, or they limp with some marginal hands that they think are not good enough to raise, plus a few premium hands. When I say premium hands, I mainly mean pocket aces, and sometimes pocket kings and queens and ace king. And they are limping with those best hands, hoping someone raises so that they can then re-raise. This is not a good strategy because usually it just results in them winning a small pot with a really good hand. But that is what a lot of people do because they are deathly afraid of getting outdrawn. And I mean, hate to break it to you, but you're going to get outdrawn sometimes when you play poker in exchange for winning much bigger pots on average. So, most of these players, when they do limp with a tricky range, whether or not it's all premium hands or a mix of premium hands and marginal hands, when they do limp and then 3-bet you, when they limp re-raise, they almost always have only the best hands. Most players are not limping and then re-raising with a hand like ace-5 suited or 10-9 suited. Or
That's true. The limp re-raise doesn't really... People really don't play that as a bluff pre-flop. It's probably a good move. The problem is we haven't defined a range yet from certain positions when to do that. And it's hard to figure out because, like, how do you determine if you have... I mean, it's probably going to contain an ace in your hand, but how do you determine if you have ace-5 suited in first and somebody raises you in the low jack? How do you determine to 3-bet it as a bluff on occasion? It's kind of hard to do because you're representing exactly aces or kings, and anytime you're doing that bluffing, it's, you know, representing such a small range. It's really not a great strategy because it just doesn't fly, because the other person looks at their hand, they have king queen, and they go, well, you know, it's hard for this guy to have kings. Or they have, you know, ace jack, and they go, what is he doing? Does he have kings? I have an ace. And they'll flop, and, you know, then you get into a whole tricky situation. So not a good limp bluff range. So it's usually limp trap to raise.
or pocket threes. They're just not doing it. I have ran into some people like that. They exist, but most people are not doing it. You're also going to find that most people are only capable of being tricky from the early positions, because when they limp from, let's say, the cutoff seat, they only have the button, small blind, and big blind yet to act who can raise. And quite often the small blind and big blind won't raise because they're going to be out of position and they just want to see a cheap flop, right? So in that scenario, the players in the late positions when they limp usually just have very straightforward ranges, whereas the early positions are where people get a little bit tricky from. So when you're facing a tricky limper who you think has a range that is generally pretty strong, you're going to want to limp behind and see a flop with hands that flop well. These are the implied odds hands we discussed earlier. That's going to be small and medium pairs, suited aces, suited connectors, and not a whole lot of hands like big card, little card, like king 10 offsuit or queen jack offsuit. These hands may appear to be good, but they are not good if your opponent's range contains a whole lot of pocket aces, kings, queens, and ace king. So, if you...
Side note, if you're playing in the micros and low stakes like I am, you're going to want to be still raising those hands from the cutoff and the button, because like I said, you're going to run into very few tricky limpers. So when you're raising, you're up against like usually a small pair, sixes and lower, or some weird suited connector that the person just wants to play out of position for no reason. So when you make the bet, you take the lead away, and then you can pretty much bet range on the flop unless it's a completely mid-stakes monotone board. You can pretty much just take it away 90% of the time. Now, 1 in 20 times maybe you're going to get that raise from the tricky limper, and then you can just go ahead and just muck those hands. But those Broadway cards are perfect removal cards, and they have enough. Like, you don't need ace king to play on the button. You only need like jack king or something like that to play the hand the exact same way, because you just need removal. You don't really need the premium hand.
If you are going to play those hands like king 10 offsuit or ace 9 offsuit, you're going to want to raise with them or fold with them. And you're essentially raising with them as a bluff because they have blockers. Remember how we discussed how having an ace in your hand makes it less likely your opponent has pocket aces by 50%. Well, if you think your opponent's limping range, the only good hand in it is pocket aces, it's now half as likely given you have that ace X in your hand. So that is the situation where...
Should probably let Jonathan Little finish the section before putting in my own stuff, because I'm just saying the same thing he's saying just a minute earlier because I've learned this already. So maybe it's good for my own reinforcement.
Where if you are going to play a hand like ace 10 offsuit, you should definitely raise it, with the idea that if you get limp 3-bet, you should fold, because you won't be getting the correct implied odds with a hand like ace 10 offsuit ever, because, well, that hand has reverse implied odds, right? Also, you may find that it is okay to raise for value with the intention of folding if you do get re-raised with a hand like ace-queen offsuit. Because what's going to happen is if they limp, you raise with ace-queen offsuit, and they re-raise you, you can be pretty sure they have a hand like pocket aces, allowing you to fold. But if they limp and then call your raise, they're going to have a whole lot of hands like ace-5 suited or queen-jack offsuit, right? That ace-queen does really well against. And that is fine. You can raise with a hand like ace-queen offsuit and then fold it if they re-raise. I know it may feel a little bit weak, but it's usually going to be the right play if you're against a very strong range. So let's take a look at an example. Here we have pocket eights against an under-the-gun tricky limper. And in this scenario, you have to ask, should we raise or should we call? We're obviously not going to fold. 200 chips is not a lot of our stack, and we are very happy to see a flop here. So in this situation, if we raise and get re-raised, can we still call and see a flop? Whenever you do have a hand like pocket eights and you're facing a raise or re-raise, very often you're doing what's referred to as set mining. That is when you are just trying to make 3 of a kind on the flop. And if you make 3 of a kind, you're thrilled and you put all your money in. And if you don't, you get out of the way. Remember how we discussed implied odds earlier? You wanted to be getting about 10-to-1 implied odds with these small pairs when you are trying to make 3 of a kind? Well, that is referred to as set mining. So in this scenario with pocket eights, I think we should definitely just limp, because if I raise, let's say 900 chips, and someone re-raises me, usually the tricky limper, I'm going to have to fold. Let's just think ahead about how this could happen. If our tricky limper makes it 200, we make it 900, he makes it 3,000, I would now have to put in 2,000 to win my opponent's 12,000 stack. So we're going to be getting 14,000 chips total. That would be the pot plus our opponent's stack, divided by the 2,000 we'd have to put in, which would give us 7-to-1 implied odds, which is not 10-to-1. See how we have to think ahead a little bit about how things are likely to play out in the worst case scenarios, assuming you think the worst case scenario is actually kind of likely, and against tricky limpers it actually is kind of likely. Whenever you are facing limpers, by the way, you should usually raise to about 3 times the last bet. In this scenario, that was 200, plus any additional money in the pot. In this case, that would be 300, because there's 100 in the small blind plus 200 from the big blind. So we'd make it 3 times the last bet. That'd be 600 plus 300, which would be 900. So against a limper, only one limper, if you want to raise, you want to make it 900. And we'll be...
That's a pot size bet, 3x his bet plus the other money in the pot. That includes antes and stuff. You can also do this the quick way that I learned how to do it dealing PLO, which is if I were to call, there would be 200 in front of me here, plus his 200 is 4, plus this 200 is 6, plus that 200 is 7, meaning 700 if I call, and then just add your bet back in. Add 200 more, 900. That's a pot size bet. Same math, 3 times this bet, and then plus this, plus this. You're literally just doing math between your stack and the other stack here, the opener, who opened for a limp, and then adding what's left. Either way works, but some people just get it one way faster than others.
Discussing how to determine how much to raise in other scenarios, but you're usually going to find that 3 times the last bet plus any additional money in the pot will give you a pretty reasonable raise size. That said, in this spot, we're definitely just going to call. Call. This is all fine. I should also mention, a lot of people think I have pocket eights. I have the best hand most of the time, and I don't want to lose the pot with the best hand. But realize, even if we have the best hand, it's too vulnerable to raise and then get re-raised. That would be bad. It would be really, really bad. So you really want to not have the bad outcome happen with a hand that can just flop very well. It is okay to put in 200 chips and then just lose the pot. It costs you almost nothing, assuming you have a hand that actually does have the potential to make a strong hand a lot of the time. I would not call here with 8-6 offsuit or even Jack-10 offsuit because they're not quite good enough. But a hand like pocket eights or suited connectors or suited aces, those hands are more than happy to call. All right, here we have a raise on the button to 1200, and now the under the...
The tourney the other night, I ended up 17th. Just one of those ones where when I had to win the races, I didn't win the races, but did pretty well. It wasn't bad.
Gun Tricky Limper makes it 2400. Well, here we have that same set mining opportunity. We have to put in 2,200 chips to try to win. Let's say we're going to stack one opponent on average. That's going to be 14,000 total. 14,000 divided by 2,000 is 7. So we're getting 7-to-1 implied odds. Is that the required 10-to-1 implied odds? No, it's not. Also, you have to ask, is our pocket eights good enough on its own merit to happily put the rest of the money in if we get a very favorable flop like 7-4-2? And I would say no, because if you think about the tricky limpers under the gun strategy, it should contain a whole lot of aces and kings, which we're dead against. So we're not getting the right implied odds. Our hand is not good enough to continue here, so we need to fold. Also, this is even a worse scenario to call because every once in a while this player on the dealer button is going to re-raise. Like say the under the gun limper has kings and this guy on the button has aces. They just are going to end up getting the money in which case that makes me fold out 2,400 chips total. That would be a disaster. You cannot just go around putting in a fifth of your chips and folding in a scenario where you're kind of unlikely to actually see the flop. So this is just an easy fold. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of people get annoyed at this spot and think, oh, I lost the pot. But that's okay. We lost basically no chips here. In this scenario, there is an all-in. There is a call. Pocket aces. Who'd have thought? And this guy has ace-queen. Let's talk about this guy's ace-queen play. In this scenario, I would definitely just call. A lot of people think that when they have a decently strong hand that they must raise it. But that is just not true. In this situation, is it all that bad to put in 200 chips in position with a hand like ace-queen suited and then just fold if you miss the flop? That's perfectly fine. This is a spot where this player made a big mistake by raising and got maximally punished. If he did raise this and got re-raised here, it would have been a terrible spot. I guess you're probably supposed to call 1,200 more in position because he's getting very good odds. But going all in is like the worst thing you could do here. This was a very, very poor play by this player. But hey, you'll find that players make poor plays all the time, and if you are there to capitalize on them, you will profit. Now let's discuss playing against one straightforward limper. So these players usually have junky ranges that do not contain the best hands because they would have raised if they had their best hands. So you're going to find that you usually want to raise with roughly a similar range that you would raise if everyone folded to you, because their range is going to be mostly garbage. Go back to the charts we presented earlier. When everyone folds to you, you can play roughly those ranges. Against some really weak limpers who only limp absolute garbage, which some people do, you may be able to even play wider ranges. There are a few exceptions, though. In general, you want to raise pretty much every time with the strong linear part of your range, which is going to be your best pairs, your middle pairs, and big cards that don't really mind seeing a flop heads up. And the hands that you would perhaps want to call with are going to, again, be the implied odds hands. The small pairs, the weak suited aces, the suited connectors, suited gappers, and perhaps even decent offsuit connectors like queen-jack offsuit, jack-10 offsuit, 10-9 offsuit. And again, when you get limp 3-bet, definitely get out of the way. Realize that you may think someone is a weak limper, but maybe you're wrong. It's important to realize that your reads are not always going to be 100% spot on, and there's a chance that this straightforward limper you thought you were playing against is actually a tricky limper. Let's take a look at a few examples of this. Here we have a limp from a straightforward limper, and we have a big offsuit high card hand. This is a great spot to raise. I'm going to raise to, well, take a second, think about it. 3 times the last bet plus any additional money in the pot. That's going to be 900. 3 times 200 is 600 plus 300 more is 900. So I'm going to be raising to 900 in this scenario. basically every time, if I had any just obviously good hand like ace 10 suited, ace 10 offsuit, pocket eights, king jack suited, I'm going to be raising all of those. I would also probably raise with hands like king 10 offsuit, king jack offsuit, queen jack offsuit's probably fine. Jack 10 offsuit, I'd probably go ahead and raise that too. You see we're kind of getting a little bit loose here. But with hands like a suited ace or a suited connector or a small pair, I would definitely just call and try to see the flop. So in this scenario, we do raise. And what's going to happen most of the time in this spot is everyone's going to fold back to the initial limper, and they're either going to fold, giving us the pot, or they're going to call. And then we're going to see a flop in position with what is probably the best hand. And we're going to be discussing post-flop play a lot later in this masterclass, but when you're in position with probably the best hand, it's usually going to go pretty well for you. In this case, the opponent does call, and that's where we end up going. We're not going to go through this hand now because we're talking about pre-flop play at this point, but we will discuss scenarios like this extensively later, so know that is coming.
Anytime you see this set up with the poker coaching background and all like that, these are actual hands that Jonathan Little's played. Usually when you see it in this format, of the replayer, this is usually one that he played live. The online ones are usually replayed through Poker Tracker, but be aware he's not just creating these, he's actually taking these from real examples that have come up.
Here we have a straightforward limper again. We have 7-6 suited. This hand is fine enough to just call the 200 chips. The one time you may not want to call the 200 chips in this spot is when you think someone behind you is going to raise very frequently. Like I said earlier, some people really think that their only option when someone limps is to raise, which is not the case, but some people think that's their only option. And if that's the case, you should probably raise or fold this. But if you did think someone you attacked was going to consider raising with a lot of marginal hands, you'd probably rather just raise this yourself, interestingly enough, because if you raise, now they're going to usually play straightforwardly. But in most scenarios, I'm just going to call the 200 and see the flop in position. Also notice that if you call here and someone makes it, let's say, 1,000, you have to put in 800 more to win a pot that's going to be something like 3,000. Plus, you can win another 12,000 chips from your opponent or 11,000 chips from your opponent, something like that. And that's going to give you actually reasonable implied odds. It may not be the full 20 to 1 you would like, but it's going to be like 18 to 1, and that's probably good enough with a suited connector in a multi-way pot because there are two people who could potentially pay you off. You're just going to get paid off a little bit more often when there are more people who could pay you off.
It's one thing to note that those situations don't come up very often for me, and I kind of miss them sometimes when they come around because playing at the smaller stakes, aggression is really key and position is better. So those situations where there's a limp and I'm limping behind, you can, me personally, you can narrow my range down to the pairs, the suited connectors, and suited aces pretty much 100% of the time, just because I'm looking for something, like you said, with those close implied odds in a multi-way pot. Because the other thing, too, is when somebody raises and other players call, you get into hands that share cards. You get into guys who have, like, queen-jack that are limping that get raised by ace-queen. So when there's three of you in the pot and you're sitting there with 8-9 or 6-7 of diamonds or something, they're sharing cards, so they're even less likely to hit the board than actually you are. Now, you're going to have to determine if they have an overpair, if you're only playing against one, you're only playing for one pair, but you're really looking for straights, flushes, and two pairs in that scenario. And there's so many times where the flop will come off big card and two straight cards or even two pair that I have, and you just end up stacking the person or just getting the correct odds to draw or get the money in all the time. And it really is a moneymaker. So other than that exact scenario, you really won't see me doing the limp behind. I'm rarely going to do it with something that could be raised against a weak field, because the straightforward limper, the tricky limper, doesn't really matter. The only really times you're going to see the tricky limper thing is late stages of the MTTs where, a player has 15 blinds, let's say, and they're in first position and they have aces. And they just limp it. Like, you're going to see that quite a bit, but you're going to be on a table where everybody's got, between 10 and 30 blinds. So when somebody raises, getting all the money in isn't unreasonable. But it's just good to be aware of that it's like when you see small 3-bets post-flop, or pre-flop, both players have 30 blinds, a guy raises to 2 blinds, another guy makes it 5.5. You kind of have to worry about that when it comes from early position, because what they're doing essentially is just trying to reopen the betting so they can get the money in. So other than those two specific scenarios deep in tournaments, it's pretty much always going to be just a raise from me.
All right, so that's when you're facing one limper. Now let's discuss when you're facing multiple limpers. In this scenario, the main question is the first limper tricky or straightforward? Because you're going to find that the second, third, fourth, fifth limpers, they would usually raise if they had a strong hand, because once one player limps and another player limps, quite often that sets off a cascade of limpers, and you really don't want to limp it behind with a hand like pocket aces into a 7-way pot, because while you do have the best hand, someone's very likely to outdraw you, and you're not making them pay any amount of money to outdraw you. So the main question is the first limper tricky or straightforward? If they're straightforward, you probably want to raise a little bit tighter than you would normally raise. If the first limper is tricky, you don't want to do a whole lot of raising at all. Like we said earlier, you just want to do a whole lot of limping behind.
This is like a limp squeeze is what you'll see. Like you'll see players on the button, somebody limps and then they get 2 callers and the person's on the button, or even more so the small blind. And somebody in that range can actually have a looser range because of their positional advantage or disadvantage post-flop, but they get to act first post-flop if you're in the small blind. That's when you'll see the big bet comes in just to try to make a steal. It's really strong near the button because you see a lot of players getting timid, but then they go, shit, I can't call this raise. But those raises typically have to be bigger. So pot size bet plus a few extra blinds. So it's just a good thing to note that that's a perfect scenario for squeezing, because like you said, when you see one limper, you're going to see, once you see the second one, it's going to be like, okay, well then the third guy's like, well, now I can call with the 5-4 diamonds. And the next guy's like, well, now I can call with the, king 10 of clubs or something like that. And then it gets to you on the button and you're sitting there with jack 10 suited or something even playable. It might just be to your best advantage to go ahead, if you have proper blockers, to go ahead and raise and just take the pot down. Plus, being on the button, people are going to know that you're probably going to go after the pot. So bigger bet there makes the good squeeze play.
If you do think the limpers are all especially weak, like let's say the player in the cutoff limps and the player on the button limps and you're in the small blind, maybe you can really get after it and bluff a decent amount if you think that they're going to fold a large amount of the time. You're usually going to want to stick to the same formula I mentioned before, 3 times the last bet plus any additional money in the pot, but raising large may be justified. So let's take a look at a few examples here. Here you have pocket 8s against a tricky limper and 2 other limpers. Take a second, think about what you would do in this situation. This is a spot where I think we have a very clear call, because we really do not want to get limp re-raised, and we will some portion of the time. So just call here and see the flop. That is what happens, and we go to the flop. Notice when we are playing 6-handed, well, someone's very likely to have something on the flop, and if it's not you, it's probably your opponents. And even on a board like this, King 6-2, you're probably just going to be beat, and if someone bets at this pot, you get to fold and move on with your life. But this is actually a good result. We put in 200 chips, we got to see the flop, we didn't get 3 of a kind, so we're done. Let's take a look at another example. We have a straightforward limper, 2 more limpers, and we have pocket 7s now, so slightly worse hand. But in this spot, you should be way more inclined to at least consider raising. A hand like pocket 7s is kind of on the cusp of playability in this situation. In terms of raising or folding, you're definitely playing the hand. But I would tend to raise in this spot. If we are going to raise, we want to make it 3 times the last bet plus any additional money in the pot. So in this scenario, 3 times the last bet would be 600 plus 2, 4, 6, 7. So 600 plus 700 is 1,300. I'll show you how to do it again. 3 times the last bet, whatever the last bet is. 3 times 200 is 600 plus 2, 4, 6, 7. 6 plus 7 is 1,300. So that is what I do. And only one player calls. And again, this is a fine scenario. Like I said, what's going to happen on the flop very frequently is we have the best hand before the flop. We have position. This is a great spot to be in, and we are going to profit a huge amount.
This is a good spot to remember that your opponent, if they have 2 unpaired cards, is only going to get a pair on the board about 33% of the time, and they're only going to hit top pair about 25% of the time. 33% of the time when they hit a pair. So understanding board texture makes these scenarios much easier to bluff post-flop. So, and here's the other thing. This is one where if an ace hits, if it comes off like ace 5-4, and your opponent checks, you can pretty much bet and bluff all the time, because he never has an ace. Unless it's exactly a suited ace, he never has it. And he surely doesn't have an ace that can withstand, a flop, turn, and river bet scenario with just one pair, because he knows we're going to have ace king, we're going to have ace queen a lot. This is where range comes into it. And unless we're up the very rare scenario where he has two pair with that ace five, where he either flopped it or picked it up later, we're going to be good, because that only happens like 1 in 40 times on a board run out. So just good things to keep in mind that'll make you bluff the flop when you think it looks bad. Like an ace on this flop is actually really good for us. Things that aren't good on this flop are like queens and jacks and nines and, middling cards, kind of low broadways. Tens are obviously never good, because, players are going to limp jack 10, queen jack, not so much king queen, queen 10, all those suited varieties, and all pairs. So those kind of boards are the ones to watch out for. And you can, sometimes, because you can't determine does the guy have 10 jack or queen jack, when the flop comes off, jack high and he checks to you, you can check. If it comes like jack 9-4 or jack 8-4 or whatever, you can just check behind when the player checks, and then, deuce on the turn, he's going to check again. You still don't have to bet. And then the river comes off and it's like something that doesn't change it. It's another deuce. You're going to see these players then bluff a lot, because like they missed all their draws. They're taking a shot at it. You haven't shown much interest. And this is where you get into hero call territory. But really, it's not even a hard call to make. This is like the pocket threes that I played in, I think it was Jedi Mind Tricks number 8, where a player was betting and the board was a 4-card straight and paired the river. And I just had pocket threes. It was like 7, there was like 6, 7, 8, 9, or no, it was like 7, 8, 9, 10, 10 on the board. And we just went check, check on the flop. He bet the turn. He was the original raiser. I called it, and then he bet the river, and it just looks like there's nothing, and I was able to snap it off. That's where your experience comes in and understanding what people are doing with their hands. So this is not ace king when he's doing this. He's not limp calling ace king. It's just not a thing. So good thing to remember when then bluffing this board, because most of the time you're not going to hit a set
amount in this situation. If the straightforward player limp re-raised, I would have folded, because we're not getting the right odds to set mine. I would also raise in this scenario, by the way, with hands like all the big card hands that are strong. I would probably just limp behind with stuff like jack 10 and queen jack offsuit. King 10 offsuit, I would probably use that as a raise, as a bluff. Ace 10 offsuit, I would definitely raise. Ace jack, king, queen.
When he says raise as a bluff, what he means is he has that removal in his hand of having a 10, having a king, one big card, one good straight card, where if we get called by a hand like jack 10, we hit the 10, we bust the person, but the king's not good for us. So when we make the raise there and somebody re-raises us, well, obviously we're just folding. So our intention pre-flop is completely player dependent on what they do versus our actions. So having those bluffing hands in your range where you're literally like, okay, I am now pre-flop bluffing. That's a concept people don't understand. You actually pre-flop bluff quite a bit once you realize the dynamics of the deck. And it's not always a squeeze. Situations like this, like you said, with king 10, queen 10, honestly, I throw ace 10 into it because players play a ton more aces in the micros. And they will play hands like ace jack incorrectly, so you can just absolutely get pipped. But hands like king queen, you're then playing that hand for value. But yeah, so anytime you have good removal, you're going to have a pre-flop raise and fold range, meaning you raise pre-flop, somebody re-raises, you're just going to fold it.
Ace king, all those I would definitely raise. The good suited connectors and like jack 10 suited, queen jack suited, I would probably raise those as straight up for value as well. Ace 9 suited and better, I'd probably raise. The ace x suited lower than that, I'd probably call. Pocket 6s and lower, I'd probably tend to call. So that's roughly what I'm doing in this spot. The hands that flop really well, I'm just happy to see a flop. And the hands that are pretty strong, that perhaps also have good blockers to your opponent's continuing range, I would likely consider raising. All right, so now let's discuss.
Yeah, that's true, Gray. The MTTs, are where the fun's at. I think that's why people like watching them on Twitch more than, cash games and whatever else. But the truth of the matter is you have to commit to a lot of time. So if you don't have the time for it, you might as well, you can always play something you do have time for. And if you play your hands properly in cash and tournaments just the same, it's worth it just to get in more hands. The concept of thinking about not the events you play, not the tournaments you play, but the hands you play kind of matters. Because, I know that if I get in a certain number of hands every month, I'm going to be profitable. So it's just a matter of determining how that is. Now, granted, you're going to have variance. It's going to bunch up. You're not going to cash because, you know, you're going to win, your normal percentage of hands, but at the wrong time. You know what I'm saying? I mean, plus there's times where you don't really choose the tournaments you win. And in a day, my buy-in range will range from $3 to, up to as much as $22. And sometimes you brick all the 22s and you win the $3 one and you just break even for the day. So you don't really get to choose where that happens. But yeah, don't discount getting in a few cash hands. You can have 20 minutes and play some cash and actually help and get experience and get your hands in where you can. So it's always good to do that.
A situation that comes up every once in a while where someone limps from the later positions and you are pretty confident their range is very weak. So we have a button limper and a small blind limper.
You see this happen on the bubble quite a bit.
In this spot, the common play that most people make is to just check and try to play their Jack 2 offsuit for free. But I actually think raising in this spot is quite powerful if your opponents will fold the vast majority of the time. And you're going to find that a lot of people do. So in the spot, I think a very, very strong play is to just put in a raise with your hands that are very, very trashy. And the reason is because if you do just check, you're just not going to win the pot all that often because your hand is really, really bad. But if you do raise, usually what's going to happen is both players fold because we already know the player on the buttons range is really garbage. And the player in the small blind, if they had something decent, they would probably have raised with it. So the small blind's range is probably pretty weak. So this is a spot where I like a raise. If you are going to raise in this scenario, the way you can kind of do the math is 3 times the last bet, which in this case would be 200 plus any additional money in the pot. That would be 1,000. But anytime you're out of position, you usually want to raise just like a little bit more. So I think 1,200 is pretty nice. You may find that some players always call a 1,200 raise in this situation. Some people will always fold. If they're going to call 1,200 every time, don't make this play as a bluff, right? Or consider raising even bigger as a bluff. Like imagine you could put in even 2,000 chips before the flop here. If that's going to make your opponent on the button fold very close to every single time, it's a pretty powerful play because you just win the pot every single time. And winning the pot every single time just by putting in the money is very, very, very strong. So definitely look out for situations like this, especially if players are playing in your games that are especially weak. Now let's discuss when you limp and get raised. Right? We've already seen a few examples of that, but in general, you want to ask, what are my pot odds and or implied odds? If you have a hand that's getting the right implied odds to call, you usually should. If you have a hand that has reverse implied odds, like King 10 offsuit, King Jack offsuit, etc., you should basically always be folding. Those hands do not do well against reasonably strong raising ranges. If your opponent makes a large raise, like say it goes limp, 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 and then someone makes it 12 big blinds, it's a pretty big raise, in that spot, you should pretty much fold the majority of your range, and if you are going to continue, just want to continue with the best hands. If it goes limp, 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 and then someone makes it 2 big blinds, which you will see from some particularly bad players,
yeah,
you definitely want to call with basically everything because you're going to be getting incredibly, incredibly good odds. So always consider the amount your opponent makes it as well. Here we have this example again, tricky limper, limp, 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 limp. We have a raise to 1,400 on the button. And we have the tricky limper calling. So this is a situation where, again, you want to ask, am I getting the correct implied odds to call? So we have to put in 1,000 or 1,200 to win a pot that's going to go up to 4,800 or so. So that gives us 4 to 1 right there. Plus, we're putting in 1,200. That gives us another, we'll call it 9 to 1 from our opponent's stack. That gives us 13 to 1 implied odds, give or take a little bit. 13 to 1 is way more than 10 to 1. So this is a situation where we should call. I had a very recreational player show me a hand like this one time when they said, well, it was an easy fold. I'm probably behind. And yeah, you're behind every time, but you're getting the correct implied odds to justify sticking around. If we had a suited connector in this spot, though, like 9-8 suited, it may look pretty, but it's probably not quite good enough to call because we're out of position against the initial raiser, and we're just not getting quite the right price. So this is
and the reason for that is because when we hit a 7, it's very likely the best hand, and it's going to take a lot more of the board to make us, the likely best hand with a hand like, 9-8 of diamonds or whatever like that. We're going to need straights, we're going to need 2 pairs, and even 2 pairs can get crushed and counterfeited. So that's really the purpose here, where it's, it seems like it's a longer shot to make something with the pocket sevens, because your sets aren't going to hit as much as you're going to get a slice with, 8, 9. But the slice that you get is going to be strong enough to justify getting your stack in. So that's the concept with that, just as a side.
Situation where you have to have some discipline with the suited connectors and with hands like ace 5 suited. If we had a hand like ace 10 suited, I would probably go ahead and continue by calling. If I had ace jack offsuit, I would just fold for sure. Ace queen offsuit, I think, is pretty close between calling and folding. And so I'm calling in the scenario with the pairs, and I am probably folding a lot of the other marginal suited connected hands and big cards in this spot. So that's it. That's how you approach playing against limpers. I would really tell you, don't get too fancy. Don't think that you must raise limpers every single time they limp. That is a big mistake a lot of otherwise reasonable players make. And if you just stick to these strategies, you will crush the limpers.
Yeah, I think when you're playing against limpers, I mean, like I said, the majority of the time I'm raising. But like you said, there's no hard and fast rule. I think the number one thing that's a factor, and it's a very rare instance in poker, is that when you're playing against limpers, your hand kind of is very dependent. So like if you have a hand that's good to limp behind and play multi-way, sure, go ahead. If you know that the player limps way too much, like they have a VPIP of 30 or more, then you can start raising those wider, but it depends on what the players behind you are doing. Now, if you're in the big blind, it's an easy thing to do to make that big raise and just take it down. And then you only need some card removal, like one Broadway card is fine to do that with. And if your hand is just utter trash, like 7 deuce, then you can just check it and maybe flop trips. Who knows? But that's one of the few scenarios where your hand matters because more than your stack and position, because you're really just trying to cheaply gamble and see a flop and make something good from there. So let's play the quiz. Straightforward player out of his 70 fig blind stack from the cutoff, you have ace 8 off on the button. Okay, straightforward player limps. You should. See, now this is kind of interesting. He's in the cutoff, we're on the button. He's pretty straightforward. I think we're just going to raise here. Yeah, because this is just one where our hand is more so that bluff range. So we don't want to call it. He's got a big effective stack. He's just limped it. There's his limp plus the blinds and antes is 1.5, 2.5. Yeah, 4.5 is fine. Right. Straightforward limper because he's just going to fold pre-flop, right? That's what we're doing there. Tricky limper out of his 75 big blind stack from the hijack. You have ace 3 offsuit on the button. You should. Honestly, it's a fold. He's too likely to re-raise you, and he's too likely to have something good. If this was ace 3 suited, sure, you could call all day, see the flop with him. But yeah, this is just a fold scenario. 3 tricky players limp out of their 75 big blind stack. You have 9-8 suited on the button. That's probably the best scenario in the world for you to call because you'd rather see a flop, and if you raise, you're going to get re-raised at some point. So just a call. 3 straightforward players limp out of their 75 big blind stack. You have ace 10 off on the button. I don't love it. I think this is one of those rare scenarios where we're going to call because, they could be getting tricky with queens, jacks, kings, hands like that. I think the hand is a little bit too strong just to give it up. Normally with the offsuit, Broadway hands with an ace, I kind of like raising, like ace queen off, I would probably raise, and then if I got re-raised, fold. But I think this hand is too weak to justify that because we are going to get raised a fair amount of the time. So I think I'm just going to call it, see the flop, try to make an ace, and go from there in position with all the information that I get. So, ooh, really? Oh, straightforward. Duh. I was counting them as tricky limpers. Don't listen to anything I just said. That was for tricky limpers. These are straightforward limps. Yeah, the raise is much bigger because you're on the button and there's 3 of them. Sorry. I read the question backwards. All right, let's see how long the next section is. Because there are some other things that I wanted to go into. Next section's 19. minutes. It is now noon. This is a bigger topic too. Like, these topics are going to go kind of depth. Like, that last one was 20 minutes. It took us about 45 minutes to get through, or 40 minutes to get through. So I don't really want to start the next section. I'll do that tomorrow because today is a play day, most likely. So I want to be able to get offline and come back and grind at about 3 o'clock. But I do have a couple things I have to do. I got to do some cooking and stuff. Might skip it and just play cash, but if I do, I'll make sure to stream it. Definitely playing some form of poker today. But thanks you guys for coming out. I appreciate you guys being here in the morning. And you're going to see that there's this thumbnail on YouTube. It's going to have a different number here and here. Today's going to be part 3, number 54. This is all going to be the same section of this tournament masterclass, the 60 big blinds greater pre-flop strategy. So I made it this uniform thumbnail. So when you see this, you can just go through that. I'd appreciate it if you watched it on YouTube. One, because it doesn't stay up on Twitch for very long. So you're going to miss pieces, but it's always on YouTube. And two, because, I need the YouTube to start getting some action, man. I put in a lot of effort over there. Did you say you were playing tonight? Yeah. I'm thinking of playing tonight around 3 o'clock, so that's in about 3 hours Vegas time. Like I said, not 100%, but even if I don't play MTTs, I'm going to play something. So I might just play cash. You like the YouTube stuff? Thanks, Gray. My next YouTube project is kind of crazy because I've done 9 Jedi mind tricks. Usually those are made up of 3 or 4 hands. I decided every 10th one, I'm going to take the leftover clips that I have that I don't have anywhere to really put them and make them into an archive of, funny stuff and interesting things that don't really fit into other videos. I kind of got left over with all these hands. So I've got 12 hands or 15 hands for it. What is that, 12 or 15? Yeah, 15 hands here that are going to be in that next one. So the next one's going to be kind of long. And it's going to take me a little while to put it out, but every 10th Jedi mind trick is just going to be the Jedi archives. So hands that are interesting or funny or, something weird happened or maybe we made a joke or something like that, that I clipped out of the stream that haven't been posted anywhere, I'm going to put them together every 10th Jedi mind trick. So I think it's fun, but it's going to take me a shitload of time to edit. So it's going to be another 3 or 4 days. If I don't play today, I could probably get it done in 2 days, but I really want to play, so we'll see what happens. But either way, appreciate you checking out the YouTube, and I'll see you guys later today. And always, noon every day, we're going to keep going through this masterclass. We're going to review my hands and just go through the basic stuff, just keep on plugging through. And I'll see you guys later. There's a bunch of people streaming. I'm not going to send out... You know what? I'll send you guys out to a host. So stick around for that, and we'll see you later today.